Foundation, and this is the Libertarian Angle, the show, as you all know, that brings you the libertarian perspective on what's going on in the world. Today I've got as my co-host Richard Ebeling, who teaches economics at the Citadel. Richard and I go back a long way, and some of you longtime supporters of FFF will recognize Richard as he was the vice president of academic affairs for the Future of Freedom Foundation from our inception in 1989 all the way up to the time that he became president of the Foundation for Economic Education. I guess that was about 15 years later or so. I met Richard many, many years ago. I was practicing law in Dallas, and he was teaching economics at the University of Dallas. And I'd heard about him. Somebody had told, well, it was the head of the department there at the economics department at UD that said to me that he was hiring the guy of my age group that knew more about Austrian economics than anybody else. And so I met Richard, and I actually hired him to tutor me in Austrian economics. And we did a chapter-by-chapter analysis. We would meet once a week, and he gave me a chapter-by-chapter analysis of human action. And so then Richard from there went on to Hillsdale College, where he was the Ludwig von Mises Chair of Economics there. Then went on to FEE, and now he's teaching at the Citadel. He also taught at Northwood University and other schools. And so, Richard, it's great to have you here. I thought what we would discuss today is Austrian economics. I mean, that's your field, and it's an important part of the libertarian movement. To me, it's really the central economic philosophy of libertarianism. So I thought, hey, who better to come onto the show and talk about Austrian economics than you? So take it away.
Well, it's my pleasure to be here with you, Bumper. I'll just tell the viewers, and I have to tell the story, give me a minute here, is that when Bumper approached me about being his tutor, I had this new job at the University of Dallas. I was a young whippersnapper at the time. I have to do lesson plans. I don't have time for this. So then he offers me money, right? You know, the market, the price system works. So I agree. I mean, I meticulously prepare lecture notes. We're going to go through Human Action, Mises's great book, chapter by chapter. And I soon realized half the conversation had nothing to do with Ludwig von Mises. He's asking me, well, how do you feel on this issue about libertarian philosophy? And that is, it's like I'm passing a litmus test. And I realized that I was being paid just to answer questions and discuss libertarian philosophy. And on top of that, when the session was over, he treated me to lunch. This was a great deal. No work, good pay, and a free lunch. Then he left. You have no idea how depressed I was. Anyway, I had to tell
look,
Bumper,
man,
I'm sorry.
I felt like you needed to pay you to straighten out all your leaks of libertarian philosophy, your compromises. So why don't you give us a synopsis of what Austrian economics is? Because, people could accuse you of being unpatriotic, Richard, that you believe in Austrian economics and not American economics. So why don't you tell us a little bit about what that means, that term, for people that are not really familiar with it?
Right. The term Austrian economics was coined in the late 19th century. It was actually coined as a pejorative term by the critics of those who did not like what became Austrian economics. But it was founded by an Austrian economist, logically in Austria, in the 1870s named Karl Menger. He challenged the classical labor theory of value upon which Karl Marx had built up his exploitation theory of workers by supposedly evil and greedy capitalists. He developed a theory of how prices emerge out of the subjective choices and valuations and interactions of people in the society. And that grew into a school. He had two major followers. One was a fellow named Eugen von Böhm-Bawerk, and the other one was Friedrich von Wieser. They took Menger's ideas and developed them, elaborated them into an entire system of understanding the nature of the competitive market process, with taking the individual and his free choices and decisions as the starting point of the analysis, and explaining that we cannot understand society if we don't begin with that elementary building block, the individual himself. And then they had students. And to make obviously a long story short, in the 20th century, in the early decades of the 20th century, the two leading members of the Austrian school were Ludwig von Mises, who is pictured right behind me there where I'm pointing, and Friedrich A. Hayek. Mises had studied with von Bavarick at the University of Vienna. Hayek had also studied at the University of Vienna with the other early Austrian, Friedrich von Wieser. And they came to know each other in the immediate post-war period. And Hayek, who was about 19 years older than Hayek, became sort of his mentor. But what they then did is they took these early ideas of Menger, von Bavarick, and Wieser and extended and elaborated them in ways that have become the body of what we call Austrian economics today in the 20th century, now the 21st century. Let me sort of explain the core applications and their importance. Mises gained his first notoriety internationally because he challenged the rising ideological movement of the 20th century, socialism. There had been critics of socialism before the First World War, before the first experiments with communism in following the Bolshevik Revolution in what became Soviet Russia. There had been critics of socialism. They had said that socialism, by collectivizing everything, would break the link between work and reward, and therefore people would be less productive and less industrious when they don't know that if they work hard, the reward will be larger. And they also pointed out, these earlier critics of socialism, that if the government took over all the means of production, land, labor, capital, centrally planned everything, then the government becomes the ultimate monopoly in society. There's no escape from the government. So the government becomes the ultimate tyrant. It determines where you work, what education you get, your life opportunities, since it controls all the media, what gets printed, what gets published. So you are a prisoner of the state in a monopoly controlled by government. But what was not really challenged was the more, it sounds mundane, but really everyday profound question. Okay, the revolution comes. The government is nationalizing all the private property. They're going to centrally plan everything. And let's, for the sake of the argument, say that the people in charge of this socialist experiment are benevolent, good-hearted people. They're not tyrants. They love their fellow man. They only want to do good for others in society. There's nothing malevolent in them. How would they know what to produce, how to produce, and do it better and more efficiently? The competitive market. That's what Mises challenged. He said, Mr. Socialist, you're in charge. You don't know what. He said that in the market economy, people come together in their interactions between supply and demand. Consumers tell producers what they want, and they express their values and the prices they're willing to pay. The sellers look at the cost of producing, and they inform consumers at what price they could afford to bring the product to market. And market prices act as the informational tool for people to make economic calculations. What would it cost me if I bought this bundle of goods or that bundle of goods? As a producer, if I tried to manufacture a product with these combinations of labor and capital versus a different combination of machines and tools and labor, what would the two combinations cost me in terms of monetary outlays at the prices I'd have to pay to purchase them, hire them, use them? And that these two sets of prices that the market generates through the interactions of competitive supply and demand for finished goods and for the factors of production enables what Mises called economic calculation. You can compare selling price with cost price. Would this be a profit or would it be a loss? If it would be profitable, would this product be more profitable, the bigger profit margin, or some other product? And as a consequence, prices, through this economic calculation ability, guides, directs, steers the entire economic process to see that supplies match demands, that people are using resources where the greatest profits are in terms of what consumers most highly value. And this coordinates and integrates all that goes on in the market. Now,
No, go ahead.
What Mises then said is that now let's think of what a socialist economy does. It abolishes private property. So there's nothing, particularly with means of production, machines, tool, land, hiring workers, there's nothing to buy and sell. If there's nothing to buy and sell, there are no potential mutual gains from trade. If there are no mutual gains from trade, there's no incentives to make bids and offers to each other. If there's no incentive to make bids and offers to each other, there's no higgling of the market. And if there's no higgling of the market, there's no agreed upon terms of trade. And if there are no agreed upon terms of trade, then how do we know what people want, what value they place upon things, and what it would cost to bring anything to market? You've destroyed like the signal, the indicator that enables order and coordination of everything. And that's why Mises said socialism in practice, a fully planned economy, would lead to what he referred to in a later little book of his, planned chaos. And that was a devastating critique, because it basically said that at the most elementary and functional level, a socialist economy could not rationally use resources with any degree of efficiency and productivity and rational guidance to produce what people in society as consumers want compared to a functioning market economy.
Yeah, that was a real eye-opener to me when I read about what became known as the socialist calculation debate, because we're also accustomed to prices in American society that it's really difficult for us to imagine a way of life where the government is setting the prices. And we see how the prices come into existence here. It's through supply and demand, people entering into an exchanges, as compared to just a decree that says the government says this is what's going to be charged. And so when the socialists had their systems in the Soviet Union or North Korea or China, they could kind of get a semblance of what the price of something should be by looking over at the United States or at a free market type deal. But when it hit me, I said, well, what if there's just a bunch of centrally planned societies where the government is doing this in every country? Where are the prices that they look to? And that's when it really hit me that the socialist system is fatally flawed. And I think that's one of Mises's big contributions. But, you know, Richard, when I discovered libertarianism, I of course, read Milton Friedman. And Friedman had a big influence on my life. And then the same with Hayek. Hayek, you know, his essays and his book, Constitution of Liberty, had a big impact on me. But Mises hit me right in the right place, because Friedman all too often accepted the premises, it seemed to me, of the welfare state and said, let's see how we can manage it better, like with vouchers in public schools or a certain amount of quantity of money that the Fed will be able to increase by. Now, he would sometimes tell the goal, which I think was good. A lot of libertarians don't do that. But it was, and then, you know, Hayek compromises with some support of the welfare state, for example, in the Constitution of Liberty. But Mises, to me, was the no compromiser. I mean, here was the uncompromising case for how a market economy works, which is really how a free society works, where people are interacting with each other. And then he talks about prices, and he talks about money and how money comes into existence. And to me, like, human action was like a Mozart symphony. But it's a complicated book. It's very, very difficult. To me, if we were going to recommend a book to somebody that Mises wrote, my favorite, very favorite, is Economic Policy, which is a series of speeches that he gave in Argentina in the 1950s, possibly The Crisis of Interventionism, where he talks about, you know, his theory with respect to government intervention. What do you think?
Mm-hmm. Well, for a general reader who wants to have a feel for Mises's way of understanding the free society, the importance of liberty, the functioning of the market, I would recommend two books, which he meant for a general or popular audience, not one of his big books. And that would be a book that he wrote in 1927 called Liberalism. By, of course, he meant, as I know you know, Bumper, classical liberalism, individual liberty, limited government, rule of law, and laissez-faire free markets. And he lays out his conception of the case for basically the truly free market economy, with a chapter on foreign policy in there as well, in which he talks about how these principles would apply to the non-interventionist sense of foreign policy as well. The other book that I would recommend, on more narrowly perhaps on this issue of planning versus the competitive free market, would be a little book that he published during the Second World War called Bureaucracy. And he has two core chapters. One is called Profit Management, and the other is called Bureaucratic Management. And he's basically contrasting there the nature of how a free market works and rationally enables supplies and demands to be coordinated in the profit motive for efficiency, versus the heavy hand of a bureaucratic method where the state manages and directs everything from a center. So those are two valuable books. If I can also talk about one other he made many contributions, but another one, perhaps most relevant to things going on right now in the United States, is his contributions to monetary theory. And in fact, before he wrote his works on socialism and government planning and so on, before the First World War, he published a book called The Theory of Money and Credit. It came out in 1912. And the core of this book was to argue, that the business cycle, which had existed in the 19th century, the booms and busts of inflations and recessions, many people believed that these were caused by something inherent in the market economy itself. What Mises argued is that this is not inherent in the market. If one understands the working of the markets, including the interaction of supply and demand in financial markets, there are savers, there are potential investors, savings is scarce, people want to borrow it for investment purposes rather than people using their income for more immediate consumption. And financial markets bring savers and investors together like any other market. And there's a market price that brings supply and demand into balance. And it's the market price to borrow money over time. It's called the rate of interest. And when left alone, the market tends to establish a price like any other price, a rate of interest that brings savers in balance with investors. And therefore, consumption and savings is balanced with resource investments that will bring about output for consumers in the future. What he argued is that central banking by governments inherently involve a distortion and a misdirection of the financial markets. Governments print money, and as a result of this, inject money into the banking system and distort the interest rates. It makes it appear as if there's more funds, savings available in the economy for investment purposes than really exist. And as a consequence of this, you have a mismatch, an imbalance between savings and investment in the economy that sets the stage for the business cycle. And the result of this is that this government manipulation of interest rates through monetary expansion in the banking system sets the inevitable stage for a bust following a distortive boom that precedes it. Now, to bring this more concretely to our situation over let's say the last 15 years, between 2003 and 2008, our central bank, the Federal Reserve, increased the money supply by approximately 50%. That's a lot of monetary expansion in a relatively short 5-year period. And again, if you look at the data from the Federal Reserve, what you find is that this huge monetary expansion artificially pushed interest rates practically to zero. In fact, when you adjust for inflation, for much of that time, they were negative. In other words, banks were, in a sense, giving away money for free, given the value of the money that would be returned when the investor paid it back. It is not surprising, then, that you had the housing bubble, you had the investment boom, you had individuals getting overreached with cheap consumer credit that was available, and that all set the stage for the eventual bust in 2007, 2008, 2009. And this is all clearly understood and interpretively intelligible if you use Mises's ideas. Now, more recently, to continue this, is that rather than allowing really a full adjusting correction, letting the market sort of throw off the imbalances and distortions during the boom period by a period of rebalanced adjustment, the downturn, to get the economy on a sustainable path of long-run growth, the Federal Reserve, since 2008, 2009, has continued to expand the money supply. Indeed, from 2008 until now, they have increased the money supply in the U.S. economy by over $4 trillion. That's not a B, that's a T, $4 trillion. Interest rates during this period have been zero. Key interest rates in the banking sector have been at zero, near zero. And again, when you adjust for inflation, these are negative rates of 1, 2, even more percent negative rates of interest. And now again, what this has basically done, and if I can link it back to Mises's critique of socialism, why are prices important? Because they bring supply into balance with demand. They tell people what can be produced and how much would be available and what consumers think it's worth that they might be willing to pay. The Federal Reserve basically has created a financial market with no price system. They've made interest rates zero. A zero price means it's so plentiful that it has no value. So it is inevitable that there has been occurring over the last 5 years a huge distortion of the savings and investment relationships in this economy through this massive expansion of money that inevitably, whether we've seen price inflation or not, will inevitably require a correction, because whatever investments have been funded by all of this monetary expansion will be found to have been misdirected and distorted because it had no relationship to the reality of available savings to sustain the investment projects to completion and then to maintain them over time. We're heading towards another fall. Austrian economists always emphasize you cannot predict the future. You look through the crystal ball as through a glass darkly, but like causes bring about like effects in the qualitative sense. And whether this correction of a new recession occurs 6 months from now or 2 years from now, the stage has been set because of the continuing distortions that our central bank has imposed upon our economic system. And, of course, we could continue with this bumper because, of course, what this leads to is, of course, the Austrian critique of central banking itself and the policy prescription that Mises and Hayek and other Austrians have had to devise ways to separate government from banking and the money supply. In other words, take it out of the hands of government to turn that crank of the monetary printing press, which is the heart of all of these instabilities that our economy goes through.
Yeah, that was the big contribution, or one of the big contributions when I first discovered Austrian economics, because I've been brought up the way all of us are brought up. We were taught that the Great Depression was a failure of free enterprise. As the stock market crashed in 29 showed that free enterprise just doesn't work, that it produces these big crises, and that you need government intervention to fix the problems associated with free enterprise. And so when I was reading Mises and Hayek, and to a certain extent Friedman too, and Rothbard, and realizing that the Great Depression, the stock market crash, was all a result of the Federal Reserve manipulation of money, and that this central bank had come into existence in 1913, I was just shocked. And that, of course, then leads you to a rediscovery that in the United States for more than 100 years, there was no central bank. There was no fiat paper money. There were no legal tender laws. They used gold and silver coins as their money. And I'm sitting there thinking, wow, I mean, this is not something you learn in your public schools or in your economics classes. And that finally, it's, as you point out, it's the cause of this boom and bust. Why? Because the Fed is over there tinkering and altering a very intricate system, dealing with prices that are dealing with monetary units. You start tampering with that kind of system, you're going to end up with, as you say, the planned chaos of the socialist interventionist state.
Right. We need to think of central banking, like our Federal Reserve or the European Central Bank or the Bank of England, all the others. These are monetary central planners. The government has put in the hands of a handful of people the central planning of what quantity of money there should be, what the value of money should be, how interest rates should be manipulated and set, not by markets, but by policy manipulative fiat, which means they're not telling the truth. In one sense, when I'm in a classroom teaching my introductory economics students, I'm explaining supply and demand and the role of prices, and I emphasize that prices are priceless. You got that? Prices are priceless because they are the core element to tell people what is scarce, what things are worth, and to tell them the prices at which things could be balanced and coordinated so people can achieve their ends with each other through a mutual exchange process. Distort prices, abolish prices, and you prevent markets, including financial markets, from working. And this is what central banking does. It centralizes all monetary and banking issues and prevents markets from telling us the truth about the reality of supply and demand conditions. That's why many Austrians, in fact, the vast majority of Austrians, would argue that as a policy prescription deduced from the logic of their analysis of money and banking, if you don't want booms and busts, if you don't want inflations and depressions, in this type of way that has been occurring now for about 150, 200 years in the Western countries, what you need to do is to end central banking, to make banking once again a private competitive affair in which government has no control of it. Now, again, if I can just add to this too, Bumper, You had mentioned Milton Friedman. Milton Friedman, anyone who had a chance to see Milton Friedman, you can go on YouTube and see him in his prime, his TV interviews in the 1960s and 70s. There are few are as persuasive and articulate and incisive exponents of the basic core of individual freedom and the importance of free markets. But he had a blind spot on this money issue. And through most of his professional life as a serious scholarly economist at the University of Chicago, he said there had to be a central bank. But what he wanted was the central bank to be like on an automatic pilot. Rather than the discretion of the central bankers, well, we'll increase the money supply by 2% and now 7% and we'll do this. He said, no, like automatic pilot. Just set a rule that the money supply will be increased by 2 or 3% a year, come hell or high water. So you take away the discretion of the political manipulation. But after he won the Nobel Prize, he won the Nobel Prize like Hayek did in the 1970s. In the 1980s, he wrote a series of articles, again in scholarly economics journals, in which he said the following. He said that he's come to the conclusion from the teaching of other economists who are called public choice theorists. They're the ones who apply economics to understand the dirty logic of how politics and the political process actually work. He said, these other economists who apply the logic of economics to the political process have persuaded me that it will never be in the long run self-interest of politicians and bureaucrats to keep their hands off the monetary printing press whenever they find it politically advantageous to do so. And he therefore gave up the ghost. He said, no, my rule of a paper money on automatic pilot cannot work because politics will always intervene. He then wrote another piece. He wrote these 2 or 3 articles like within a 2-year period. This other article in which he said that I'm not willing to advocate a gold standard. Okay, that's what he's saying. But now looking over the history of the 20th century from the perspective of the mid-1980s, looking over the history of the 20th century, if the United States had stayed on a gold-backed monetary system, whatever the inconveniences and the mining and minting costs of a gold standard and storing gold in a vault, whatever the costs and inconvenience of a gold standard might have been, in the face of the inflationary distortions and costs and hardships that paper money had created in the 20th century, it would have been better if the gold standard had never been left. So that's from Mr. Follow a Rule Paper Money advocate. So even Milton Friedman, though not willing to go to the case for private banking or a gold standard, was giving up the ghost that you cannot trust. You cannot trust this to be in the hands of the government.
I remember reading a piece by Friedman. I think I'm not mistaken on this, where he said, here's my modest proposal for the Fed, but then he put a parentheses that said, my real proposal, my extreme proposal is abolish it, which I thought was a big success for the Austrian camp, because he was saying, okay, but assuming you have the Fed, this is what we should do. Well, what I loved about Mises is that he didn't operate under those kind of assumptions. He says, if you want a free market society, here it is. And like you say, that the Austrian school, yes, it praises the idea of where the gold coins and the silver coins were the official money of the United States, the so-called gold standard. But really, the ideal is, and this is what Hayek was pointing out, was the denationalization of money, a separation of money in the state. And when I read that, I said, wow, yeah, that's the real key to this, is don't let government handle the money at all. The second best solution is a gold coin, silver coin standard. But the ideal solution is turn money over to the market. As you say, privatize the banks, let it be competitive, just like corporations compete against each other in the production of goods and services, and they can compete for depositors' money. They can offer different interest rates, have different levels of risk. But I wanted to, in the few minutes we have left, I also wanted to point out about Mises's concept of interventionism, Richard, because that to me was so insightful, where Mises says one government intervention inevitably leads to more interventions because of the crises that each intervention produces. And we see this time and again in the monetary field. We see it in immigration, where you have this endless series of crises, the drug war, Social Security. It never stops. And I think that was really an insightful thing that when he says one interventionism just keeps leading to more.
Right. See, his argument was this. When the government intervenes with these sort of these discrete interventions, a price control here, a wage regulation there, a production restriction or prohibition or requirement someplace else, it's true, it's not as devastating as when the government nationalizes everything and imposes planning from the top down. But what it's like sand in the machine, right? The gears no longer are functioning smoothly to keep the machine itself working the way it's supposed to in harmony and productively. And for example, if the government sets price controls, well, let's take this entire issue. Many viewers, of course, will understand this from listening to you in the past. Let's take the minimum wage issue. The market says this is what people are worth based upon the people who are looking for work and their skills or unskills relative to those who are potential employers looking for people to hire to do specific jobs. Now the President of the United States comes along and says, no, there has to be a minimum wage of $10.10. Now, as an aside, why 10.10? Why not 9.99 or 11.11? Why 10.10? Was it some magic number that he got from the entrails of a goose? I don't understand this. Why 10.10? But anyway, you now set the minimum wage at 10.10. And what if employers don't think that anybody is worth more than $7.50 or $8? Anyone who the government says has to be paid X, when an employer thinks he's only worth, given the value, added value he gives to the production process that he's hoping to earn, as a profit from selling a product of only $8, you're going to price that person out of the market. He's going to lose his job. Now, if that person loses his job, what happens then? Then inevitably in our welfare state, now he has to be supported by government safety nets. And that introduces more controls and regulations and higher taxes or more government borrowing to fund that. And then you have the problems with people being taxed too much, the deficit as a drag on the economy, and it all snowballs like this. The important thing to realize is that a lot of people say, businessmen why can't they just pay a person, what the government says seems fair? I would just ask, which one of us pays more for something than we think it's worth? If you go into the supermarket and you see that breakfast cereal was $3 a box, and at that price you bought 2 or 3 boxes a week because you're a big breakfast cereal eater. But now you go in the next week and it turns out to not be $3 a box, but $7 a box. Is it beyond the realm of common sense that some of us are going to say, at $7 a box, I'm going to stop eating that breakfast cereal or less of it? Why would you expect that a businessman is any different, who has only one source of revenue from which to pay those he hires or the resources for production that he purchases? And that is the anticipated revenue, given what he thinks consumers would be willing to pay, given their value for a product that he hopes to market. If he is told that he has to pay more than what that person does as added value to his production process relative to what he thinks consumers would be willing to pay the product, that's the same thing as me saying that's not worth it anymore. It is being priced above what I'm willing to pay. And you just as the breakfast cereal will sit unsold on the shelf as unsold inventory, with labor it's called unemployment. And then that snowballs with all of these effects. All of these regulations and interventions can be taken and be shown to create the same type of logical imbalances, distortions, problems in the economy that make things worse rather than better.
Yeah, I don't know if it was Mises. I think it was Mises, but somebody once said that that intervention. Why is Congress so mean is to make the minimum wage less than what they themselves earn in Congress. And then another aspect of this, they've had a 40% unemployment rate among black teenagers because of the minimum wage.
Yes.
And a lot of them are sucked into the drug trade. They see an easy
Absolutely.
way to quick money and so forth. And anyway, Richard, we're out of time. That's the show. Thanks for coming on. It's been a great discussion. Yeah, time goes by fast when you're having a good time, huh? but it's been great having you on.
My pleasure, Bumper. My pleasure, as always.
Enjoyed it. We'll have to do it again. This is the Libertarian Angle. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next week.